Chapter 1. 3 days has passed since Ryder's disappearance, and his friend group and close relatives were growing increasingly worried. Elizabeth has been pacing back and forth in her bedroom, looking at her phone, out of hope that Ryder would respond to her texts or calls any time soon. The rest of the friend group lounged around a living room, guns blazing with theories on what could have happened. Maybe he got lost in the woods and just can't find his way back, Penelope suggested, trying to sound as optimistic as possible. Jonas, ever the voice of reason, spoke up from his spot on the couch. But he's been in those woods so many times before. He knows them with the back of his hand. It doesn't make sense for him to just disappear like that. Gabriella, despite her being the life of any party, has been unusually quiet since Ryder's disappearance. Her eyes held a haunted look as she stared off into the distance, lost in her own thoughts. The weight of uncertainty hung heavy in the air, suffocating any remnants of hope that lingered in the room. "I can't shake this feeling that something terrible has happened to him," Gabriella finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Elizabeth stopped pacing and turned to look at her friend, concern etched across her features. "I know, Gabby. We all feel it too," Elizabeth said softly, placing a reassuring hand on Gabriella's shoulder. "We have to stay strong and keep searching for him. We can't give up." David, ever quick to make a remark, shook his head and said, "This is all starting to sound like a bad horror movie. I'm sure Ryder will turn up soon, probably just playing an elaborate prank on us." But even as he tried to lighten the mood, his eyes betrayed his own fears. The group fell into a somber silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the weight of Ryder's absence pressed down on them. Michael had been the most affected by Ryder's disappearance. He had always been the closest to Ryder, sharing secrets and dreams that no one else knew about. Now, with his best friend gone without a trace, Michael felt like a part of himself was missing. He couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest since that fateful night. "Do you all think he may be at Deadwood Vale?" Michael's voice cut through the heavy silence, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. The group turned to look at him, surprised by his question, and he spreads his arms wide. "Think about it, guys. Where else would Ryder would be at? We all know he's smart enough to not go to that cursed forest. Whether out of idle curiosity or something big at stake, Deadwood Vale could be the last place we'd think of searching for him." "Him? At the Deadwood Vale? Michael, we all know you're a believer, but even you know not to mess with cursed forests," David quipped, trying to lighten the mood. The group chuckled weakly, but Michael's expression remained serious. "I'm not joking, guys. What if Ryder did go to Deadwood Vale for some reason? We have to at least consider it as a possibility," Michael insisted, his eyes pleading with his friends to take him seriously. The group went silent as Michael's words hung heavily in the air, a tense silence settling over the room. Elizabeth could see the desperation in his eyes, the fear that clawed at his voice as he spoke of Deadwood Vale. She knew that Michael wouldn't suggest such a dangerous place lightly, and a seed of doubt began to plant itself in her mind. However, before anyone could respond to Michael's suggestion, the channel on the TV changed to a news reporter, who adorned a grave expression. "Aurora News here, a 21-year-old woman was found wandering by the edge of Deadwood Vale earlier this morning. She claims to have no recollection of how she ended up there and is currently being treated at the local hospital for severe dehydration and exhaustion. Many have rumored that it also taken local resident Ryder Edwards, and he has reportedly to yet be found. Authorities are currently investigating these unusual causes and officials are urging to be cautious around Deadwood Vale, as strange occurrences continue to be reported in the area. If you discover anyone who had no memory of how they located themselves in the desolate forest or have any information about the recent disappearances, please contact the authorities immediately. Stay safe, everyone." Michael's heart dropped at the mention of Ryder's name, his worst fears confirmed by the news report. "Well, at least it confirms Mr. Doofus's theory. Ryder really is in Deadwood Vale," David remarked, a hint of unease creeping into his voice. "David, for once, stop calling Michael names and take this seriously. What if Ryder really is in danger out there?" Elizabeth's voice was laced with worry as she turned to Michael. "We have to do something. We can't just sit here waiting for the authorities to figure it out. Let's go find him ourselves." David groaned and leaned back in his chair. "Elizabeth, you can't be serious," he said, rolling his eyes. "This is like every horror movie ever. You know, the one where the group of idiots ignores all the warnings and goes straight into the creepy place. And then bam! They get picked off one by one. Penelope nodded, crossing her arms. Yeah, we're literally living out a cliché here. I mean, didn't you hear what the news just said? Strange occurrences. No memory of how they got there? It's like they're handing us the script to our demise. She shuddered, but her nervous chuckle betrayed the anxiety bubbling beneath her sarcasm. Elizabeth wasn't having it. This isn't some movie, you two. Ryder's out there. He could be hurt, or worse. Are we just going to sit here and hope the police magically find him in time? Michael, pacing near the window, clenched his fists. If Ryder's in that forest, then we have to go after him. I don't care if it sounds stupid, or reckless. He's my best friend. And you know what? His voice cracked slightly. Maybe we're the only ones who can help. Wait. Jonas raised a hand, clearly trying to be the voice of reason as usual. I get it. Ryder means a lot to all of us. But if we go rushing into Deadwood Vale, we're just going to end up lost like him or worse. This isn't some adventure movie where everything works out in the end. Before anyone could reply, the television flickered with static and the news anchor reappeared. Her previously grave expression was now etched with lines of worry and her voice quivered with fear. The light from the screen cast eerie shadows on the walls, creating a tense atmosphere in the room. We interrupt this broadcast with urgent news regarding Deadwood Vale, she began, her voice shaking. Authorities investigating the area have discovered a body, mangled beyond recognition. They believe it may be linked to the strange occurrences surrounding the forest and the recent disappearances. We urge everyone in the surrounding area to stay indoors, lock your doors, and avoid the woods at all costs. The air seemed to still and the noise of chatter and movement died down as the weight of the news settled in. The room, as if it wasn't any more tense than it already is, was becoming more and more heavy and suffocating. The energy in the room became a stagnant pool of shock and disbelief. Every eye of the group was frozen on the source of the news, their expressions ranging from stunned to aghast. The tension in the room was palpable, like a thick fog that had suddenly descended upon them all. As the words sank in, a heavy silence enveloped them, leaving nothing but space for their thoughts to race and emotions to process. It was a moment frozen in time, suspended in an eerie stillness. David broke the silence, his voice a mix of sarcasm and genuine horror. Well, so much for the cliché about surviving the night. David. Elizabeth snapped, but even she couldn't mask the fear in her own voice. Her resolve was shaken, and she knew it. Penelope hugged herself, her usual optimism completely gone. What if Ryder's next? What if we go in there and... Her voice trailed off as she glanced at the others, the unsaid possibilities weighing heavily on all of them. Michael's face was drained of color, but his determination still remained. That doesn't change anything. If anything, it means we have to go now. Before it's too late. Jonas looked torn. Michael, I want to help. We all do. But going into Deadwood Vale now, with whoever, or whatever, is out there, we could get killed. Elizabeth, her heart pounding, tried to rally her strength. But Ryder's out there, too. We can't abandon him. Not now. Gabriella, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke, her voice low but resolute. Elizabeth's right. If it were any of us, Ryder would go in for us without a second thought. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not going to sit here and let him die alone out there. A tense hush fell over the room, the only sound the soft hum of the air conditioning. Each person's expression betrayed their inner turmoil, uncertainty and apprehension mixed with a deep sense of loyalty and concern for their absent friend. They were all grappling with the same internal struggle, unsure of what to do next in this unfamiliar situation. Finally, Jonas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right. Fine. But we're going to need a plan. And we're not going in there blind. Michael nodded, determination burning in his eyes. Agreed. We'll go in together. And we'll get Ryder out. Frantically gathering what they could, their fingers fumbled through the cluttered room for flashlights and supplies. The air was thick with a palpable sense of dread, like an impending storm that threatened to engulf them. But despite the fear, each of them felt the nagging urgency in their hearts. Time was running out and Ryder's fate hung in the balance somewhere in the dark depths of Deadwood Vale. They were determined to find him and bring him home, no matter what dangers awaited them on their quest. The very thought of leaving a friend behind was unbearable, driving them forward with a fierce determination. The group arrived at the edge of Deadwood Vale just after dusk, the thick trees casting long, menacing shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the black abyss of the forest. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and a biting wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it an unsettling silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that gnawed at their nerves. Perched on a hill, they could see the distant glow of police flashlights flickering through the dark. The lights danced and bounced off the trees and rocks, casting eerie shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at the darkness. Authorities were still scouring the area near the entrance, their stern faces visible in brief flashes as they moved in and out of sight. With each passing moment, the tension in the air grew thicker, heavy with anticipation and fear. It was as if time had stopped and all that remained was this eerie scene illuminated by flashing lights and uncertain murmurs. Elizabeth pointed toward the officers. "We can't let them see us. If they catch us here, they'll force us to go home. Ryder's counting on us." Michael nodded, his jaw clenched with a mix of fear and resolve. "We'll take the opposite side. We stay low, stay quiet, and keep out of sight." The group shared a nervous glance but agreed. With one last look toward the officers, they carefully made their way around the perimeter of the forest, keeping the shadows as their cover. The sense of danger clung to them like a second skin, each snap of a twig beneath their feet sending a jolt of anxiety up their spines. After what felt like an eternity of nervously circling the outskirts, they finally reached a secluded part of the forest, far from the watchful eyes of the authorities. With a silent agreement, they cautiously slipped into the thicket of trees, their steps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The air was cool and damp, with the scent of pine needles and freshly turned earth lingering around them. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant chirping of birds. They moved slowly and deliberately, careful not to make any noise that could give away their location. It felt like they were entering a secret world, hidden from prying eyes and filled with untold mysteries waiting to be discovered. "We stay together," Penelope whispered, her voice barely audible but firm. "No splitting up. That's how people get killed." "Agreed," Jonas added, adjusting his flashlight. "We stick to a tight formation, no matter what." David, leading the group, smirked as he clicked on his own flashlight. "Trust me, I'm not in the mood to pull any classic horror movie stunts tonight." His tone was light, but there was no humor in his eyes. They all nodded in unison, and David started to lead the way deeper into Deadwood Vale. The atmosphere grew thicker with each step, the air dense with the musty scent of decay. Monochromatic grass crunched underfoot, brittle and lifeless, as if the land itself had long since given up. The trees, bare and twisted, reached out like skeletal hands, and though the forest wasn't loud, every creak and groan of the old wood made their hearts race. As they moved forward, the group's individual reactions began to surface. Penelope was visibly shaking, her usual bravado crumbling under the weight of the eerie surroundings. She kept close to Elizabeth, glancing around nervously with every step. Gabriella's face was pale, her eyes wide as she scanned the shadowy figures of the trees, looking for any movement, any hint of danger. Jonas was more stoic, but even he couldn't hide the tightness in his posture. His grip on his flashlight was rigid, knuckles white. Every now and then, he'd mutter something under his breath, as if trying to convince himself that everything would be fine. Suddenly, a thick stench hit them, strong and metallic, unmistakably blood. The group froze, their stomachs twisting at the overwhelming odor. A few yards ahead, they saw it, the authorities, visible in the dim light of their flashlights, were loading something onto a stretcher. The remains of the mangled body from the news report. Elizabeth gagged, covering her nose with the sleeve of her jacket. "Oh my God!" she whispered, her eyes wide with horror. "We need to get away from here," Jonas urged, his voice low but urgent. "The smell, it's too much." They all quickly covered their noses and turned away from the scene, moving further into the forest to escape the sickening scent. As they distanced themselves from the authorities and the gruesome discovery, the quiet returned, but it was a suffocating, unsettling quiet that made their skin crawl. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to warp around them. Deadwood Vale had an unnatural quality to it, the monochrome grass blending seamlessly into the lifeless trees, creating an almost surreal, dreamlike landscape, except this was no dream. "Why does this place feel like it's watching us?" Gabriella muttered, her voice trembling. "Because it probably is," Michael replied quietly, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting something or someone to be following them. David's flashlight beam bounced off the branches as he led the way, his expression growing more tense with every step. The deeper they went, the more it felt like the forest itself was closing in on them, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches overhead blocking out what little moonlight there was. "I don't like this," Penelope whispered, sticking close to Elizabeth. "I don't like this at all." "None of us do," Elizabeth replied, keeping her eyes forward, even though her heart raced faster with every step they took. But she forced herself to remain calm. Ryder needed them. As they ventured further, the realization sank in, this forest wasn't just creepy. It was wrong, on a fundamental level. And the deeper they went, the more they felt its malevolent presence, lurking just beyond the edge of their perception. Despite the looming sense of danger and uncertainty, they pressed on, their feet crunching against the uneven ground. They knew that somewhere within this cursed place, Ryder was waiting for them. The thought sent shivers down their spines, but they dared not speak it aloud. Were they chasing after a living man or a lifeless body? The answer remained unknown, and yet they couldn't turn back now. Every step brought them closer to the heart of the darkness, where secrets and horrors awaited them. But they were determined to find Ryder, no matter the cost. Their hearts raced with adrenaline and their senses were on high alert as they braved the unknown depths of this accursed land. The group pressed on, navigating the twisting paths and gnarled trees of Deadwood Vale, every step feeling heavier than the last. The oppressive silence was starting to gnaw at their nerves when Elizabeth suddenly froze, her flashlight beam landing on something caught in a patch of brambles. A small piece of fabric. Blue. Her breath caught in her throat. She crouched down and carefully pulled it free, the material soft yet worn from the elements. It was a familiar shade of blue, too familiar. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the cloth, dread creeping up her spine. "Guys," she called softly, turning toward the others. This is Ryder's." "I'm sure of it." The group gathered around her, looking down at the scrap of cloth in her hands. Michael's eyes widened as he recognized it too. "That's a part of his shirt. He wore it during the graduation party, before he disappeared." Elizabeth nodded, her fingers trembling as she pocketed the ripped fabric. "There's more up ahead," she said, pointing her flashlight further into the forest where more pieces of clothing were scattered, snagged on the dead branches. Without another word, they followed the trail, every new fragment of cloth pulling them deeper into the dark heart of Deadwood Vale. The further they went, the colder the air became, an unnatural chill that cut through their jackets and chilled them to the bone. And then the whispers began. At first, it was nothing but faint murmurs, barely audible over the crunch of dead leaves beneath their feet. Penelope stopped mid-step, her eyes narrowing as she tilted her head to listen. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Hear what?" David asked, though his face betrayed his unease. "Quiet," Elizabeth strained her ears. The whispers grew clearer, but they were still too soft, too far away to understand. It was like the wind was carrying voices, but no wind blew. They continued to walk, their nerves growing more frayed with every step. The whispers intensified, still indistinct but undeniably there, swirling around them like invisible phantoms. Like a distant memory echoing through the forest, the faint sound of words slipped between the trees and sent shivers down their spines. The silence seemed to amplify the haunting presence of these elusive whispers, as if they were calling out for someone to hear them. Each word was like a thread, weaving together and forming a mysterious message that begged to be deciphered. As they strained to listen, the trees seemed to sway in rhythm with the ghostly voice, adding to the eerie atmosphere that surrounded them. "Leave. Get out. Don't go further." Michael stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Did you guys hear that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. David nodded, his face pale as he scanned the surrounding trees. "Yeah. I heard it." "What the hell is that?" "Maybe it's just the wind," Jonah suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "There's no wind," Gabriella muttered, her eyes wide as she backed closer to the group. Elizabeth's heart raced as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "We can't stop. We're close." "Ryder's close," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She couldn't let herself believe that these warnings, these ghostly whispers, were anything more than tricks of her mind. Ryder was out there, he had to be. But the hushed murmurs surrounding them grew in volume, becoming more insistent and forceful. "Leave. Turn back. Danger." Penelope's breathing quickened as she glanced over her shoulder, eyes darting around the dark woods. Guys, maybe we should listen to them, maybe we should turn back. No, Michael said firmly, though fear danced in his eyes. Ryder's in here. And I'm not leaving without him. The group exchanged nervous glances, but no one made a move to retreat. They were too far in now, too invested to turn back. The pieces of Ryder's shirt led them onward, deeper into the cursed forest, even as the whispers filled the air with their warnings. As they moved forward, the trail of cloth grew more erratic, scattered in every direction as if torn violently from Ryder's body. Elizabeth's grip on her flashlight tightened. The chill in the air intensified, the trees closing in around them, and the whispers, they never stopped. Don't go further, one voice hissed, clearer than ever. Turn back. But the group remained stubborn, ignoring all caution and pushing forward relentlessly. Each step quickened as if some otherworldly presence was compelling them onward, despite the constant warnings ringing in their ears. The air was thick with tension and fear, yet they were driven by an inexplicable force that seemed to pull them closer to their unknown destiny. Despite their doubts and fears, they pressed on, trusting in this unseen guidance that pulsed through their veins like a wild heartbeat. In the distance, a haunting silhouette caught their eye. It was a shape, dark and seemingly unmoving, slumped at the base of a twisted tree. Elizabeth's heart raced as her flashlight beam fell upon it, illuminating the shadowy figure in its eerie glow. The air grew still and heavy as they approached the mysterious object, unsure of what it could be. Each step felt like an eternity as they drew closer to the unknown entity in the darkness. It seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, sending shivers down their spines. As they finally stood before it, Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat at the sight before her, a man, slumped over and resting on a tree. He doesn't seem to be moving, even if the flashlights were shown on him. The man's face was all too familiar to the group. Gasps of shock and disbelief rippled through the group as they stared at the figure before them. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she reached out to touch his cold cheek, her fingers brushing against the rough stubble on his jaw. Ryder, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling leaves. But as her hand recoiled from the icy touch, Ryder's lifeless eyes stared up at them, empty of any recognition or warmth. At first, the group felt a wave of relief they'd found him. But that relief turned to icy dread when they saw his face up close. His mouth was wide open, as if stuck in a screaming expression, frozen in an unnatural, open grimace, and his skin ashen and taut. His once familiar, comforting presence was gone, replaced by something cold, hollow. Ryder, Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling as she took a cautious step forward. Her heart ached, torn between wanting to rush to him and the growing fear bubbling inside her. Whispers swirled around them, growing in both volume and intensity. They were no longer gentle murmurs, but rather frenzied and insistent. Leave. Get out. The warnings intensified, a relentless barrage that threatened to overwhelm their thoughts. But the group couldn't turn away, for they were too committed now. With each hesitant step, they closed in on Ryder, their movements unsure and tentative, as if they were afraid of what they might find when they reached him. The air was thick with tension, every nerve on edge as they braced themselves for whatever lay ahead. And then, without warning, a deep, guttural growl ripped through the air, silencing the whispers in an instant. The sound was raw, animalistic, and it sent a chill through each of them, freezing them in place. Elizabeth gasped, eyes widening as Ryder's body jerked violently, as if pulled by invisible strings. He slowly rose to his feet, his limbs twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. His sleeves and pant legs were ripped, his skin bruised and scratched. When his bare feet touched the ground, the earth seemed to tremble, and the sound of thunderous, heavy footsteps echoed, though his feet barely moved. It was as if the forest itself had taken hold of him, using him as a puppet. Ryder! Michael cried out, panic rising in his voice as he watched in horror. What is happening? But Ryder remained silent, his once bright eyes now clouded over with darkness. They were like two bottomless pits, sucking in all the light around them. His mouth stretched open impossibly wide, revealing long, sharp teeth that seemed to glint in the dim light. And then a sound erupted from deep within him, a guttural roar that was not of this world. It was like the voice of a demon, unearthly and terrifying. Get out! Get out! Get out! He charged at them, his body twitching and jerking violently, his feet pounding the earth with unnatural force. Trees around them began to crack and snap as Ryder's distorted form ripped through the forest, tearing the towering trunks down as if they were nothing but twigs. Branches splintered and fell, the forest itself seeming to scream in agony at the chaos he unleashed. "Move!" Jonas shouted, shoving Gabriella out of the way as a tree came crashing down behind them. David grabbed Elizabeth's arm and pulled her back just in time as another tree fell in their path. "We need to get out of here. Now." Elizabeth was frozen, her wide eyes locked on Ryder. The sight of him, her boyfriend, the person she loved now possessed by something so terrifying, twisted into something monstrous, was too much. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps as tears filled her eyes. "Elizabeth, come on!" Penelope shouted, grabbing her hand and pulling her away. The group scrambled to find a clearing, dodging falling branches and trees, Ryder's distorted voice booming behind them as he chased after them, his body convulsing with each step. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" The words followed them, an echo of something dark and ancient, pushing them forward, driving fear deeper into their hearts. They ran, faster than they thought possible, their legs burning with the effort. The demonic growl seemed to be right behind them, growing louder with every second, and they couldn't afford to stop. The forest, once silent and eerie, was now alive with chaos, trees falling and snapping, leaves whipping past their faces as they sprinted toward the edge of the forest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they broke free from the thick canopy of deadwood veil and stumbled out onto open ground. Their legs gave out, and one by one, they collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding painfully in their chests. For a long moment, they just lay there, the night sky above them a stark contrast to the hell they had just escaped. The air was still, the oppressive weight of the forest lifting, but the terror still lingered in their minds. Elizabeth sat up slowly, her hands shaking as she wiped away the tears that had fallen during their escape. Her mind replayed the image of Ryder's blackened, empty eyes, his distorted body. She felt sick, her stomach twisting in knots. "We found him," Michael panted, his voice thick with emotion. "But, he's not, that wasn't him anymore." "What was that?" Gabriella whispered, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "What happened to him?" David, who had always been the jokester of the group, was unnervingly silent. His face was pale, his hands trembling. He's possessed. Something's inside him. Controlling him." Penelope hugged her knees to her chest, staring blankly at the ground. "What do we do now? We can't just leave him like that." Elizabeth, her voice hoarse, finally spoke. "We need to find out what's happening in that forest. Who or what took Ryder, and why?" Jonas nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "The woman they found, she didn't remember anything. And the man," he trailed off, remembering the mangled body they saw being carried out of the forest. "This thing, whatever it is, it's tied to them too." Michael stood up, his fists clenched, determination burning in his eyes. "We need answers. We can't leave Ryder like that." "But how?" Gabriella asked, her voice trembling. "We don't even know what we're up against." Elizabeth looked toward Deadwood Vale, its dark outline looming ominously behind them. "We'll figure it out," she said quietly, her voice shaking with fear but also with resolve. "We have to. Ryder's still in there. And we're going to save him, no matter what it takes." Back at Elizabeth and Penelope's house, the group gathered in the living room, their faces pale and drawn after the harrowing escape from Deadwood Vale. The usual chatter and laughter that filled the house on ordinary days was now replaced with a heavy, suffocating silence. David was pacing the room, running his hands through his hair in frustration, while Gabriella sat curled up on the couch, staring blankly at the floor. Jonas had grabbed a laptop from the kitchen table, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he searched for anything local legends, supernatural encounters, anything that might explain what they had just witnessed. Penelope was outside, talking to a neighbor, trying to gather any local gossip or rumors that might shed light on the strange happenings in the forest. Michael sat quietly by the window, his gaze distant, lost in thought, as the weight of their predicament settled heavily on him. But Elizabeth, she couldn't sit still. She was standing in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, as if holding herself together was the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. The image of Ryder's lifeless face, his wide eyes that had once been so full of warmth, now dark voids, haunted her. His voice, "Get out," That demonic, twisted version of his own voice, echoed in her mind over and over. The haunting image of his eyes changing in a nightmarish display of possession played on a loop, and she felt as if she was losing her grip on reality. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The terror, the heartbreak, it all crashed down on her at once. Her breathing became ragged, and she stumbled to the side, gripping the back of a chair for support. I can't stop seeing his face," she whispered, her voice trembling. "That wasn't Ryder. It couldn't have been, but it was. What have we done?" Michael glanced up, his expression softening when he saw Elizabeth struggling. He got up from his spot near the window and slowly approached her. "Liz," he said softly, "we're going to figure this out, okay? We'll save him." Elizabeth shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You didn't see him up close, Michael. His eyes, they weren't his anymore. It was like something else had taken him. That thing was controlling him, making him destroy everything. What if Ryder's already gone?" Michael grabbed her shoulders gently, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Ryder's not gone," he said firmly, though his voice wavered slightly. "He's still in there. Whatever's controlling him, we'll find a way to stop it. But you have to hold on, okay? For Ryder." Elizabeth blinked back the tears, nodding weakly. I just don't know what to do." "None of us do right now," Michael admitted, glancing back at the others. "But we're not giving up." David stopped pacing and glanced over at Jonas, who was still furiously typing away on the laptop. "Anything yet?" David asked, his voice tight with impatience. Jonas shook his head, frustration clear on his face. "A bunch of old ghost stories, urban legends about Deadwood Vale being cursed, but nothing concrete. Some people claim it's a burial ground, others say it's some kind of gateway to another world, but it's all just speculation." Gabriella sighed from the couch. "We don't need stories. We need answers. Someone has to know what's going on. People have gone missing before, right? There has to be someone who knows the truth." Penelope burst back into the house, her face flushed. "Okay, so, Mrs. Yates from next door? She said her grandmother used to talk about Deadwood Vale all the time, like, way back when. Apparently, the land was considered cursed for centuries, long before the town was built." David raised an eyebrow. "Cursed? By what?" Penelope shrugged, clearly unsettled by the conversation. She didn't know specifics, but she mentioned that people who enter the forest are never the same when they come out, if they come out at all. There's talk of dark forces, spirits, and get this, people being possessed. Nervous glances were exchanged among the group, their unease palpable. The concept of possession struck too close to home after what they had just witnessed in Ryder. A chill ran down their spines as they remembered his vacant eyes and unnatural movements, a reminder that anything was possible in this strange world they found themselves in. Fear and uncertainty hung heavy in the air, like a thick fog that refused to dissipate. "What about the woman they found earlier?" Michael asked. "We need to talk to her. She was found near Deadwood Vale, and she survived, right? Maybe she remembers something, even if she said she didn't." "Yeah, but how do we get to her?" Gabriella asked, frowning. "The hospital isn't just going to let us waltz in and start interrogating her. And the cops are probably keeping a close eye on everything after what happened today." "Maybe we don't need to go through the hospital," Jonas said, looking up from his laptop. "There's got to be a way to find out more about her family, friends, something. If we can figure out who she is, maybe we can talk to someone who knows her." David sat down on the arm of the couch, exhaling deeply. "So, we split up. Some of us dig into the woman, and others keep searching the web for more information on Deadwood Vale." Elizabeth, still shaken, took a deep breath and wiped her eyes. I'll start searching online," she said quietly, her voice still trembling. "I need to know what's happening to Ryder. I can't stop until I do." "Okay," Michael said, squeezing her shoulder gently. "I'll see if I can find anything on the woman. Maybe there's a way to track her family down or get more info." The group agreed, each taking a different task to focus on, their determination renewed. But even as they worked, the eerie memory of Ryder's demonic transformation lingered in their minds, a constant reminder of the danger that still lurked in the shadows of Deadwood Vale. As the night deepened, the group continued their desperate search for answers. The tension in the room was palpable, each of them trying to process what they had witnessed in Deadwood Vale and how Ryder had been twisted into something so nightmarish. Jonas had been scrolling through news updates for hours when he suddenly paused, his eyes widening as he found something new. "I found something," Jonas said, breaking the silence. The rest of the group immediately gathered around him, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. Jonas hesitated, his brow furrowing as he read the article in front of him. "It's about the woman who was found near Deadwood Vale. She's still unnamed, but there's an update on her condition." He cleared his throat and began reading aloud. "Once the woman entered the hospital, she slowly began to regain her memories before she went into Deadwood Vale. She told the doctors she didn't remember much at first, but now she's starting to piece things together. She said that when she was in the forest, she saw a man with a screaming face." "A screaming face?" Penelope repeated, her voice filled with unease. The image sent chills through the room. Jonas nodded, continuing. "She said that she got closer to him, but when she did, the man began spewing some kind of black liquid from his mouth, and she just ran before anything else could happen." He set the laptop aside, the room falling into an uncomfortable silence. David leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Black liquid? That sounds like something straight out of a horror movie." He tried to joke, but the tension in his voice betrayed how disturbed he really was. Then, silence filled the room until Elizabeth remembered the same face Ryder made when he transformed into something demonic. Her breath caught in her throat as she made the connection, her heart pounding in her chest. "Wait," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible in the heavy air of the room. "That face, it looked like the one Ryder had when he changed." The group turned to look at her, the pieces starting to fall into place in their minds. Michael's eyes widened with realization. "You think the woman was referring to Ryder? Like, if you saw his face, then, could it be possible that it was the same face the woman saw in the forest?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of fear and disbelief. Elizabeth nodded slowly, her hands trembling. "It's too much of a coincidence. Ryder, whatever happened to him out there, it changed him. And if this woman saw the same face, then maybe whatever is in Deadwood Vale, it's spreading its influence." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the weight of their discovery settled upon them. The darkness outside seemed to press against the windows, as if trying to invade the safety of their gathering. Michael bit his lower lip for a moment before turning to Jonas. "What about the man they found?" Michael asked. "Any info on him?" Jonas bit his lip, his eyes flicking to the screen. "There's more. They released an audio recording from when they found the man." "A recording?" Gabriella asked, her face pale. "Of what?" Jonas looked reluctant but pulled up the audio file. "They recorded the investigation when they found him. It's disturbing, though. I'm not sure we should listen." The group exchanged uneasy glances. "We need to hear it," Elizabeth said quietly, her voice shaking but firm. "If it helps us understand what's going on, we need to know." With a deep breath, Jonas hit play. The room filled with static for a moment, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the forest. The audio was eerily quiet at first, but then came the faint sounds of heavy breathing, likely from the investigators. And then, suddenly, a blood-curdling scream rang through the speakers. It was guttural, filled with pure agony, the kind of sound that clawed its way into their souls. The man's screams were desperate, as if something was tearing him apart from the inside. "Help me, please," the voice rasped between broken sobs. Then there was a sickening gurgling noise, like something thick and wet filling his throat. The man's cries grew weaker, more frantic, until they faded into horrible choking sounds. The final sounds captured on the recording were a sharp, slick tearing noise, as if something was being forcefully ripped apart. The air was suddenly filled with an eerie stillness, devoid of any other noises or movements. The silence that followed the tearing sound hung heavily in the room, leaving a sense of unease and foreboding in its wake. Jonas abruptly halted the audio, his trembling hands struggling to press the pause button. The group sat in stunned silence, a mixture of emotions evident on their faces. Some looked as if they were about to be ill, while others were ghostly pale with shock and disbelief. The weight of the recording seemed to hang heavy in the air, pressing down on them like a physical force. Their breathing was shallow and quick, as if they were afraid to take in too much of the tension that filled the room. Gabriella put her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. That poor man. What the hell happened to him? Elizabeth looked like she was going to be sick. She clutched her stomach, breathing hard, the gruesome sounds replaying in her mind. It reminded her too much of Ryder, the sounds of torment, the loss of control. Michael rubbed his face, the weight of what they were facing crashing down on him. We're dealing with something way beyond us. I don't know what it is, but it's like this place Deadwood Vale. It's not just cursed. It's like it corrupts everything it touches. Or everyone who enters, Penelope added quietly. The group fell into silence again, the weight of the disturbing audio pressing down on them. Finally, Penelope spoke up, breaking the tension. I think I know someone who might help. Everyone looked at her expectantly. Mr. Owens, our science teacher, Penelope continued, her voice still shaky but filled with a new sense of purpose. He has this old friend, Thomas. I remember him mentioning it a few times during class when we were studying local history. Thomas knows a lot about Deadwood Vale's past. He's a bit eccentric, but I think he's researched the forest for years. If anyone knows more about what's going on, it could be him. Michael perked up at this. Do you think Mr. Owens could put us in touch with him? Penelope nodded. It's worth a shot. I mean, it's better than sitting here with nothing but horror stories and cryptic warnings. Elizabeth, who had been quietly processing everything, finally spoke. Then we have to talk to him. If this Thomas guy knows anything that can help us, anything about how to save Ryder, we need to find him. Gabriella nodded. And soon. We don't know how much time we have before whatever's controlling Ryder gets worse. The group exchanged determined looks. The decision was clear. They were going to reach out to Mr. Owens and, through him, find Thomas. It was a long shot, but they were running out of options. And with the horrors of Deadwood Vale hanging over them, they knew they couldn't afford to wait. We'll go first thing in the morning, Michael said, his voice steady. For now, everyone, try to get some rest. We're going to need all the strength we can get. But as they settled in for the night, each of them knew that sleep wouldn't come easily. Ryder's fate, the horrors they'd witnessed, and the chilling recording were burned into their minds. Tomorrow might bring answers, but it would also bring them closer to the dark truth lurking within Deadwood Vale. The following morning, the group was already up and ready, determination in their eyes despite the previous night's horrors. Penelope had gotten through to Mr. Owens early, and after explaining what was happening, he had given them the address of his old friend, Thomas, and promised to give him a heads up that they were coming. Penelope thanked him, and the group hurried to prepare, hoping that Thomas could provide them with some insight, or better yet, a way to save Ryder. The address led them to a worn-down shack on the outskirts of town, about a 15-minute walk from Elizabeth and Penelope's house. The place looked ancient, with peeling paint and creaky wooden beams that looked like they could collapse at any moment. The smell of damp earth and mildew hung in the air, mingling with the scent of old wood. As they approached, they saw Thomas sitting outside, rocking back and forth on an old wooden chair. He was an elderly man, his wrinkled face weathered by years of exposure to the elements, and his eyes had a faraway look like someone who had seen too much. Thomas! Penelope called, approaching carefully. The rest of the group followed, keeping close together. Thomas looked up, his piercing gaze cutting through them, as though sizing them up. He gave a nod of acknowledgement but said nothing as they settled around him. We are friends of Ryder. The guy we think is possessed, Michael started, his voice wavering slightly. We've picked up bits and pieces about Deadwood Vale and what's going on, but we need more. We need to understand what's happening to our friend. Thomas didn't speak at first. He simply watched them with those weary eyes, letting the weight of their words hang in the air. Then, with a slow creak of his chair, he leaned forward, placing his gnarled hands on his knees. I know about your friend, Thomas said, his voice gravelly and low. Owens told me. I also know what may got hold of him. The group shared uneasy glances but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Deadwood Vale's not just cursed, Thomas began, his voice filled with a somber edge. Centuries ago, that forest was used by a group of cultists. They weren't just any cult, though they were after something far darker. They performed weekly rituals, drawing on forbidden knowledge, to summon four devils to earth. These devils promised the cultists immortality in exchange for their bodies' vessels to walk in the mortal realm. But devils don't honor their deals. The group listened intently, their hearts pounding as Thomas's words painted a dark picture. The cultists, fools that they were, kept their end of the bargain, Thomas continued. They opened a gateway for the devils to enter our world. But instead of being granted eternal life, the cultists were slaughtered. The devils took their lives and twisted their souls into mindless husks, enslaved to their will. The devils had no interest in using them as vessels, they just wanted to wipe out humanity. Earth was to be a playground for demons. Thomas paused, his eyes clouded with memory. The devils nearly succeeded, but something stopped them. Something powerful, something we still don't fully understand. Whatever it was, it managed to weaken the devils enough that they were driven back. They weren't destroyed, but they were diminished. Bound to places like Deadwood Vale, where their influence could still seep through the cracks. Penelope's voice was tied with dread. And you're saying, one of these devils has taken Ryder? Thomas nodded gravely. Yes. His name is Zero, the Devil of Shadows. He was one of the four summoned by the cult. Darkness is his domain, he thrives in it. The black liquid that's mentioned, the strength, the way your friend's body was jerking and twitching, those are all signs of Zero's possession. Elizabeth's heart sank. Ryder wasn't just possessed by any spirit, he was a puppet to one of the most dangerous entities imaginable. The horror of Ryder's vacant expression, the unnatural movements, all made sense now. But what could they possibly do against a being like Zero? So, how do we stop it? Michael asked, desperation edging into his voice. How do we save Ryder? Thomas shook his head slowly, the lines on his face deepening with regret. There's no easy way. You shouldn't have entered Deadwood Vale in the first place. That place is Zero's playground now. Once you go in, you risk becoming like Harold, the man who was found, mangled beyond recognition. The group exchanged fearful glances, the weight of what they'd done settling heavily on them. But I know why you went, Thomas continued, softening his tone. He's your friend. You want to help him. That's a noble thing, but here's the hard truth: you can't fight Zero. If you try to hurt him, you'll end up hurting Ryder, too. They're bound together now. Elizabeth clenched her fists, tears welling in her eyes. The thought of Ryder suffering, controlled by this devil, tore her apart. But there has to be something we can do, she pleaded. We can't just leave him like that. Thomas studied her for a long moment before speaking. The only way to break the possession is to sever Zero's connection to this world. But it won't be easy. Zero is one of the strongest of the four devils. He won't let go of Ryder without a fight, and if you make a mistake, Ryder will be lost forever. The group was silent, the enormity of the task ahead weighing heavily on them. They had come to Thomas for answers, but what they had learned was even darker than they had feared. Are there any tools or rituals that can weaken Zero? Something to force him out without hurting Ryder? Gabriella asked, her voice quiet but hopeful. Thomas scratched his chin, considering the question. Rituals are out of the table, you can't banish what was used to bring about. As for tools, we all know the opposite of darkness is light. Zero fears the light, it weakens him. If you can find a way to bring light into the darkness that has consumed Deadwood Vale and your friend, you may have a chance. The group exchanged glances, their minds whirring with possibilities. What type of light sources can we use to weaken this Zero thing? Flashlights, lanterns, candles? Elizabeth asked, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. Thomas nodded, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Yes, all of those could work. But remember, the light must be strong and unwavering. Zero will try to extinguish it, to snuff out any glimmer of hope. You must stand firm and keep the light burning bright. The group took a moment to steel themselves for the task ahead. They knew the dangers that awaited them in Deadwood Vale, but they also knew they couldn't abandon Ryder to the mercy of Zero. And what about the other devils? Are they still out there, waiting to unleash chaos? Michael inquired, his voice filled with a mix of fear and determination. Thomas nodded. Yes. However, because they do not have the power yet, they lay dormant in the forest while Zero rises in power. Whatever happens to him, the other devils will come out one by one, each with their own weaknesses and strengths. It's only a matter of time before doomsday descends upon us if we do not stop them now. There was a heavy silence as the group absorbed Thomas's words, the weight of their mission settling in their hearts. The fate of their friend Ryder, and perhaps the world itself, now rested upon their shoulders. "Is there anything else we need to know about Zero and the others?" Elizabeth asked, her voice firm as she steeled herself for the coming battle. Thomas regarded her with a grave expression. "Zero is cunning and manipulative. He preys on fear and doubt, using them to strengthen his hold on his victims. Beware of his whispers, for they are like venom to the soul." He paused, then continued, "As for the other devils, each one is unique in its own right. They were summoned for a reason, each embodying a different aspect of darkness. Zero is but the beginning. You will face trials beyond your imagination, and you must stay united and strong if you are to save Ryder." The group nodded solemnly, their resolve hardening like steel. They knew the dangers that awaited them, but they also knew that they couldn't turn back now. Ryder's life hung in the balance, and they were his only hope. "Before you go," Thomas continued, "Zero is the leader of the devils, and he may be strong and fast on his feet, but he is not invincible. Remember this: light overcomes the dark. If you can distract him, you can dispel him with any sources of light." Leader of the devils. This caught the ears of the group, their gazes meeting in confusion and a bit of apprehension. Jonas turned to Thomas and spoke, his voice laced with determination. "If Zero is the leader of the devils, then taking him down could weaken the others. Perhaps even break their hold on Deadwood Vale," he suggested, hope flickering in his eyes. Thomas nodded at Jonas' words. "Exactly. The hierarchy among the devils is a fragile balance. If you can disrupt that balance by defeating Zero, you may have a chance at turning the tide against the darkness that plagues this land. That reminds me. I know this may sound weird, but, do they have a name? Like their group or something like that?" Gabriella asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. Thomas looked at her thoughtfully before answering. "They are known as the Withering regime. A fitting name for the malevolent force they embody. Each devil within the regime brings a different kind of decay and despair to any place they touch, slowly draining it of life and light." The weight of this revelation settled upon the group like a suffocating shroud. The Withering regime, the name itself sent shivers down their spines, a grim reminder of the formidable foes they're going up against. "We'll do it," Michael said, his voice filled with determination. "We'll save Ryder, no matter what it takes." With a solemn nod from Thomas, the group thanked him for his time and the info he has given them as they left his shack and returned to Elizabeth and Penelope's house. During their 15-minute walk back, they felt the weight of Thomas's words pressing down on them, the gravity of their mission sinking in with each step. Their journey back to Elizabeth and Penelope's house was fraught with tense silence, each member of the group lost in their own thoughts. The knowledge they had gained from Thomas weighed heavily on their minds, the looming presence of the Withering regime casting a shadow over their every step. As they approached the house, a sense of urgency gripped them. They knew time was of the essence, and they couldn't afford to waste a single moment. Ryder's fate hung in the balance, his life intertwined with the malevolent forces that threatened to consume him. "We need to prepare," Elizabeth declared, breaking the silence that enveloped them. "We can't waste any more time. If Zero gets an advantage, who knows when the others arrive, and what devastation they may bring with them." The group nodded in agreement, the resolve shining in their eyes as they set to work. Plans were made, weapons gathered, and strategies discussed as they braced themselves for the impending battle against Zero and the Withering regime. The group began to prepare for their journey into Deadwood Vale to face Zero and the other devils of the Withering regime. They armed themselves with flashlights, lanterns, and candles, ensuring they had a steady supply of light to combat the darkness that awaited them. In case they get injured during the process, they packed medical supplies and bandages, knowing that the battle ahead would be fraught with danger. Each member of the group checked their weapons one last time, ensuring they were ready for whatever challenges they may face. David, despite already prepared, was running his face down his hands and appeared to being close to having an anxiety attack, which is very unlike him, at least to his friends. Elizabeth noticed his distress and walked over to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "David, are you all right?" she asked, her voice calm but filled with concern. "First, we have a possessed forest. Next was an old man that remembers everything, then, there's a cultist group that summons devils all for their personal gain. And now, we have to take down a devil leader and his malevolent regime. This is seriously sounding like a cliched horror movie. Just so perfect. Amazing even." David grunted, running his fingers through his hair in frustration. Elizabeth sighed to herself, knowing all too well that David's outburst stemmed from the mounting pressure and fear they all felt deep down. She squeezed his shoulder gently before speaking in a firm tone, "We cannot dwell on how absurd our situation is right now, David. We need to focus on the task ahead and stick together if we want to have any chance of saving Ryder and stopping Zero, and hopefully the Withering regime in general." The group shared a determined nod, their eyes reflecting a mix of fear and resolve. Each of them knew the risks they faced, but they also knew that they couldn't afford to falter now. If that unnamed woman can survive through sheer luck, they believed they could too. "We go at midnight, under the cover of darkness," Michael declared, his voice unwavering. "Zero will be at his strongest, but so will we. And we will not split up," Elizabeth added, her gaze meeting each of her friends in turn. "Strength in numbers, remember. We stay together, we watch each other's backs, and we take down Zero and the Withering regime as a team." After a moment of solemn silence, the group gathered in a circle, their hands clasped together in a show of unity and determination. The gravity of their mission weighed heavily upon them, but in that moment, they drew strength from each other's presence. "Until then, let us make sure everything is fully charged and ready for the journey ahead," Penelope suggested, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. "We need to be prepared for whatever we may encounter in Deadwood Vale." With a unanimous agreement, the group dispersed to double-check their supplies, ensuring that their weapons were in top condition and all their gear was fully charged. The low hum of anticipation filled the room as they made their final preparations, each member steeling themselves for the dangerous path they were about to tread. Elizabeth, Penelope, Gabriella, Jonas, David, and Michael moved with a single-minded focus, their movements purposeful and efficient as they readied themselves for the impending confrontation. The weight of the unknown hung heavy in the air, but they refused to let fear take hold. They were a team, united in their determination to face whatever awaited them in Deadwood Vale. As night fell, the group felt a new sense of urgency grip them. They knew that time was not on their side, and any delay could mean disaster for Ryder, who was caught in the crossfire of this supernatural battle. "Remembered what we agreed upon," Michael said, his voice resonating with assurance. "We stay together, no matter what. Zero may be the darkness, but we have the light." As the midnight hour approached, they traversed through the usual standpoint of Deadwood Vale, their flashlights illuminating the ominous forest, the shadows dancing menacingly around them. "Hang on, Ryder. We're coming," Elizabeth whispered.